Can you tell us how the Millennium Development Goals came about? What were the key moments in them coming to fruition?
Ultimately, it was a sort of unanticipated nuclear fusion, in a way, to be politically incorrect. A lot of sort of laboratory-like processes that might have been going nowhere came together really through the leadership of the first African Secretary General, Kofi Annan, who wanted to make sure that his first major report to the world, to this astonishing meeting of more global leaders than had ever until that point happened, to sort of greet the new millennium in the 2000 UN General Assembly, that in addition to what he wanted them to say on security and human rights and many other issues, that they had something powerful to say about development. Throughout the 90s, we'd had these international conferences that had come up with individual goals around gender, reproductive health, social development, environment, etc. And you know, one group had sort of admirably tried to pull them into something a bit more usable than just a long laundry list, but they were Western donors centered on the so-called OECD DAC committee. They didn't have the global authority and legitimacy that they had when I and others on behalf of Kofi Annan liberally stole from them, no respecter of intellectual copyright, but knowing that we were doing the authors a great favor by folding them into this package that became the Millennium Development Goals. We didn't realize it was a point of nuclear fusion. You know, a somewhat laboured, somewhat duplicative, reflecting the kind of politics and committee drafting that went on, but which, you know, have, like so many things that people have didn't puzzle and sharpen their pencils enough to write over for long enough, become by accident the things that have mattered and which have shaped the development debate ever since. At the beginning, there was this glorious freedom of a small group of us in a UN basement drafting. And you know, that'll never happen again, because now there's a massive outreach effort, which is good, but a massive committeeization of these goals, which is probably bad in terms of getting something clear and clean. And to just give you a kind of sense of the relative casualness of it all, you know, we just put them to bed, so to speak. And I was walking along a corridor, relieved at job done, to run into the beaming head of the UN Environment Programme. And, you know, a terrible swear word crossed my mind when I realized we'd forgotten an environment goal. So there were almost 7 goals, not 8. And we raced back and put back in the Sustainable Development Goal. But it was a measure of the times.
So what do you think should be in the post-2015 development agenda?
Well, actually, it's a very different moment, because what David Cameron calls a golden thread has actually started to emerge. I would prefer to call it common threads, if you like, where there are some shared understandings of what makes successful development. That yes, you need an active state which is looking to the issues of the welfare of the poor and less well off, but you need a dynamic private sector to create the jobs and growth to allow that. But you need accountable institutions and the rule of law, both to police that private sector and prevent it behaving in kind of monopolist, rent-seeking ways. But you also need that rule of law to police the rights and stand up for the rights of the poor. These are threads that you will hear articulated by political leaders of very different political persuasions, leading countries of very different kinds of economic development. And so for 2015, we have an opportunity that we didn't have in 2000 to capture that consensus, to drive a greater agreement on the way forward in terms of development. At the moment, the world's poor are still in big countries like India or China, more than they are even today in Africa. But the economic success of those countries is eating away at that remaining pool of poverty very, very rapidly. So that whether it is India, China or Brazil, or Indonesia for that matter, they are going to be home to a very much smaller portion of the world's poor. Within Africa and within the world more generally, it will be heavily concentrated in an arc of, at least for now, weak and failing states, starting in West Africa, crossing over that continent, going into and going into countries like Yemen and coming out at the other end in countries like Afghanistan and Pakistan. And they are likely to be the big concentrations of poor people. What will they, at least as a correlation, all have in common? Weak and failing states. So I think just a development logic, not a democracy logic, but a development logic takes you to the point that as you have solved the low-hanging fruit of Chinese or Indian poverty and get into this trickier backlog of poverty, the higher fruit in the tree, if you like, you can't just limit yourself to better education and healthcare programs or more private sector activity to create jobs. You've got to tackle the quality of institutional development in these countries. They need accountable institutions, accountable to their people. They need a rule of law framework in which companies and people can operate. So, my view is we can get there if it is argued in those terms rather than, the natural triumph of Westminster-style democracy for the world.